Mr. Lund, let me just start with you. I want to ask you about the scope of some of these companies. And I'll start with one that I know that you have maybe a little bit of personal history with. That's Google. Google, let me just read to you a summary of Google's current holdings. Google Alphabet owns YouTube, Android and Pixel phones, Waymo, which is a self-driving car project, Project Wing, which is a commercial drone delivery service, Google Fiber, internet TV phone service, Google Cloud, G Suite, which of course is Gmail, Calendar, Hangouts, etc. Verily, that's a healthcare company. Sidewalk Labs, which is an urban development company. Google Capital, which is an equity investment fund. DeepMind, which focuses on AI. Project Loom, this is one of my favorites, which seeks to use hot air balloons to expand global internet access. Jacquard, I think I'm saying that right, which makes smart fabrics. Soli, which uses radar for touchless gesture control. And Spotlight Stories, which makes films, among other things. In other words, Alphabet Google owns a whole lot of stuff across a whole lot of industries. Here's my question to you. Is this a good idea? Is it a good idea to have one company competing in and indeed exercising dominant influence in multiple industries all at the same time?
Absolutely not. And I mean, you left off a few from that list.
I did.
Chrome, Maps, there is absolutely no reason, for instance, why YouTube needs to be connected to a mapping system. There is no reason for Chrome to be connected to cloud. And previous generations in the United States would have said, this will not be connected. And here's an example. This happened in 1913 when the Wilson administration first came to power. They found that AT&T, the great network of that age, also controlled Western Union. And so the White House called up AT&T and said, you will spin off Western Union. And they did. And the reason is that when there does not need to be connection, there should not be connection. It's a simple rule.
What about companies like, for instance, Amazon? I mean, for example, should they be able to operate a retail marketplace where you have third-party competitors selling their goods, and then Amazon itself simultaneously operate that marketplace and sell its own goods competitively on its own platform, using potentially the data it's gathered from the other third parties who are supposedly using the open platform? Is that something you think is a pro-competition policy?
It's an anti-competition, pro-monopoly policy. There should never be competition between the provider of services and the customer of those services, because we know that the provider of service, if they are integrated into that business, will favor their own goods. It's a conflict of interest. It's one of the most fundamental problems in competition policy. And then traditionally, we have always prohibited. This goes, we could trace it back in U.S. Federal law to the banking policy in the 1860s. So there's nothing new here. What's new is that we haven't applied these kind of rules to these corporations today.
It makes me wonder if maybe we talk about updates to our antitrust laws, if we need to consider an update to the antitrust laws that makes clear that these sort of massive conglomerate mergers and holdings across industries, particularly in the tech sector, Amazon, Google, Facebook, that you can be a provider of services or you could be a seller of services. You can be a neutral platform where you sell a third-party goods like Amazon, or you could be in the business of selling those goods yourself, but you can't do all of it all at one time. Do you think something like that is advisable?
Yeah, no, I think that's necessary. That would actually take us back to where this country was for 200 years. That would restore the basic structure of power that existed when we were truly a democracy, when we were making ourselves a more perfect democracy. There's one other point that I'd like to make, which is that it's when you have a platform, when you have a provider of services, and this is especially true in the era of digital economics, is that you have to ensure that that platform is entirely neutral in its provision of services. This goes back, we know this from the railways. Thou shalt you shall post your prices, and you will deal with everybody in the order in which they come. And there will never be any discrimination for anybody, because you, as a monopolist, have the power of government. we are basically ceding this power to govern to you, and therefore there will be rule of law, and the way to establish rule of law under the governance of monopoly is through no anti-discrimination laws and rules.
And let me ask you an adjacent question to this. I wonder why dominant tech platforms or dominant platforms in any industry, it doesn't have to be tech, because as we know, we're seeing unprecedented consolidation. I think, as you pointed out, some of other panelists have mentioned, consolidation that we haven't seen in the country in a century, since the Gilded Age. Why should any dominant corporation be able to merge with any other entity? And let's just zero in on the tech platforms. Why should Google, for instance, or Facebook, why should they be able to buy anything else given their dominant size at this point? I mean, do you think a rule like that would prevent any mergers by a currently dominant platform, for instance, is something we should consider?
Yes, our group has long supported a straight-up prohibition on super large corporations engaging in any further acquisitions. And actually, I would amend that to say that any corporation that is in court that is basically being charged with anti-democratic actions really should be especially strongly applied to them.
Let me ask you about this idea about an abuse of dominance rule that would make as a presumption in the law that certain business practices are just per se illegal when they are carried out by a dominant corporation. Do you think that's something that we ought to consider?
I think it would be difficult to sort of draw a line between a super dominant sort of a corporation at the national level, the international level, and a dominant corporation at a local level. One of the things that we saw was, say, the Robinson-Patman Act. It was designed to actually give people powers that they were able to deal with the dominant local monopolist, the local warehouser, we did this with local railways. You don't want to have discrimination by the short line, just as you don't want to have discrimination by the trunk line.
Very good. Thank you for that. In my few seconds here, Professor Rose, if I could just turn to you, can I ask you a little bit more technical question? What kind of thresholds would you like to see as optimal for horizontal merger enforcement?
So thank you, Senator. I haven't come up with a particular number, but there's interesting work that's just out by one of my colleagues, Mike Winston at MIT, that suggests that just as important as it may be to bring the level for highly concentrated markets down from 2,500 to maybe something closer to the old 1,800 or 2,000 levels. It's even more important to look at the change in HHI if you want to understand the change in concentration that would be created by the merger. That seems to be much more predictive of harm than levels. And so I would think that one thing that the agencies might look at as they're reviewing the horizontal merger guidelines, as they do periodically, is to put perhaps more emphasis on those changes in concentration, even for markets that might not be as highly concentrated at least under current guidelines.
Very good. My last question, Madam Chair, it's still for you, Professor Rose. Vertical mergers, under what circumstance do you think that vertical mergers along a supply chain ought to be blocked?
Well, I think those are fact-intensive exercises, but I think that we have substantially under-enforced the law with respect to vertical mergers. That's an area where it is very challenging, right? The AT&T Time Warner case, I think, demonstrated that the judge had some difficulty understanding the arguments about why the merger would be anti-competitive. I think the judges, was alluded to earlier, the judges find it easier to understand witnesses and documents perhaps than economic analysis. And I think in that case, as in some other recent merger cases, perhaps the court was too willing to take the assurances of the interested executives of the parties that all would be well post-merger. But I definitely think we need to do much more aggressive vertical merger enforcement.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair.